Hello, everybody. LC Holt here, and this is my update for the week of January the 13th. Today, I'm joined by Rebecca Ivey and
Hello.
CW Penney.
Hey, how are you?
And today, we're going to be talking about John Wayne Gacy. It's storming where I am, so it has helped us set the atmosphere, at least for me. Yes, serial killers. It's been a minute since we've talked about a serial killer. The last one was Richard Ramirez. So let's jump into John Wayne Gacy. He was born March 17th, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. His name, John Wayne, is not coincidental. His mother, whose name was Marion, loved John Wayne, the movie actor. And so John, his father, agreed to name their son John Wayne Gacy after the film actor. Now, John Wayne Gacy was the second of three children, only son. He got along brilliantly with his mother and his two sisters. He did not get along so swimmingly with his father, who, by all accounts, was probably not that unusual of a father in 1942-ish.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, he was a man's man. He thought you went out and you won the bread for your children, and the wife took care of the children and raised them and did the cooking. And, you know, he would come home and go down in the basement, start drinking. And then the kids, you know, and the wife would sit at the dinner table and wait for him to come up, hoping he's not too sloshed and not too angry. Unfortunately, this was not unusual behavior back in the old days, when I think men were more prone to that sort of disposition. Not to say everyone is totally enlightened today, but back then, you know, to be a man was to drink and to be tough and to, you know, work hard and do hard work and everything.
Show zero emotion.
That's right.
Right.
And when your son, no emotions allowed at this dinner table, and when your son, you know, doesn't really get along that well with his classmates in terms of, you know, participating in sports and stuff, what the father would do, at least in John Wayne Gacy's case, is he would say, you know, you're a wimp, kid. You're a sissy. What are you gardening with your sisters for? You got to be a man like me. Go down in the basement. Let's get liquored up. So, you know, John Wayne Gacy, I think, was a very sensitive kid. Fairly early on, he seemed to have discovered his true sexuality, which was he was gay, which probably made it all the more difficult with his father.
I was going to say, yeah, back then, yep.
Yeah, you know, back then that was not necessarily something that was readily accepted amongst boys or girls, for that matter. Maybe John was born in the wrong time. His mother, though, loved him very, very much, and he became a mama's boy, as his father loved to point out incessantly. Now, Gacy was, and I mean, I was talking to Rebecca about this briefly before we went on the air. You know, Gacy, when you talk about a lot of these serial killers, as we do for hours on end, one after the other, you end up in a situation where you see a lot of similarities going on. With Gacy, you know, he was in a situation where he was molested very early on by a family friend who was a building contractor, who would take John for rides in his truck and fondle him, which is horrific. We've seen that before with other serial killers where they were sexually abused as young children. Now, whether that necessarily plays into the psychosexual aspect of their killings later, I don't know, because many people are molested, sadly, and do not do these things. So I certainly think it was probably a contributing factor, but probably not the key to his whole psychopathy. Guys, what do you think?
Yeah, it probably had something to do with it, but
yeah,
I mean, as you pointed out, there are people to go through a lot of bad experiences and they don't end up being serial killers.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, you know, they try to live a normal life and be the best person they can and not let that define who they are.
Do you sometimes wonder if it's something that's maybe dormant and then experiences trigger it? Does that make sense, what I just said?
Yes, I know what you're saying. Yeah. I think
I don't know. It was just something that kind of popped in my brain.
Right, because Yeah, go ahead, CW.
I was going to say, I think everybody has the possibility of cracking up, I guess, is for lack of better terms, and reaching out or lashing out and acting on impulse. But the difference that between being a human and being a monster is being able to control it.
That's true. Yes. And it does seem that people like John Wayne Gacy lack the ability to easily sort of negotiate that territory. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There seems to be something missing in them that we all seem to have, that either it gets lost
conscious.
with yes,
like a conscious or a empathy or sympathy to others.
I think empathy is empathy, I think, is a good word. Yeah, exactly. He was also very good at keeping secrets early on, because the molestation that I was telling you before is one of his first secrets. He kept it from his father for fear that his father would blame him for being the cause. Now, in around the 4th grade, John began experiencing blackouts, and his health began to deteriorate. And the reason these blackouts came on were because he had a congenital heart condition. He was born with an enlarged heart.
Yeah.
And this followed him throughout his life. So for about a year, he was in and out of the hospital with these sort of fainting spells, which his father had no sympathy for whatsoever. You know, his father looked at it like, number one, I'm not even sure that you're having these, John. This might just be you trying to get attention from your mother and me. Yeah. So he had speaking of empathy, no empathy for John when it came to these health problems, which, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I was just going to ask a question. I know you're going to get to it, but when did his father pass away? I'm just asking. I didn't really read up about his.
His father passed away actually before the primary murder spree happened, but after he had been arrested and imprisoned for something else.
Okay, because I'm just wondering, I mean, if you have this much of an issue with your father, why kill innocent people? Go for the source. That's horrible of me to say that, but if your dad is just a jerk.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if
does that make sense? It's like
I don't know if maybe the
normal people would be like, I'm gonna get you. You're the one that has been a jerk my whole life.
I'd be like
screwed me over, and I figured out a way to torment you.
Well, it almost seems like with some of these serial killers, the object of their hatred becomes almost like a totem, a sacred thing that they don't touch, but they somehow have to put it off on other people who have nothing to
do with it. That's my point. I'm just like, if you got the issue with your dad, on your father.
That totally makes rational sense to me, even though I'm not condoning violence.
No, we don't do that. No, but don't hurt innocent people. Go,
Right, yeah. But again, it doesn't seem to have happened in John's case. And these, by the way, these blackouts and stuff, it was because of the congenital heart condition, but any other underlying causes for that were never really diagnosed. And it did seem to pass. So why this didn't follow him through the rest of his life, we're not quite sure. Maybe it was attention getting. I don't know. I just think if you're in and out of the hospital for a year, that's probably not the most fun thing a child can do.
No.
Maybe for a week. But if it was going on for that long, I think he probably would have dropped the act earlier. But this is just my assumption. I don't know. I do know that in around 1960, when he was 18 years old, John Wayne Gacy began to branch out a little bit. And I think a lot of this was based on the fact that he wanted to impress his father with his endeavors. And he went out and he joined the Democratic Party. He actually wound up becoming a precinct captain for his local Democratic Party. And so even at the age of 18, he was going out and kind of like learning how to schmooze with people. And people really liked John. People thought that John was, hey, if you need something, John's the precinct captain. He'll head on over and get it done for you. Or at least he can find a way to get it done for you. So, I think that probably made him feel a little bit better that he was winning friends and influencing people.
But I'm sure it didn't win his father.
It did not win his father. At one point, his father and he had an argument about a car that his father had bought him. And the deal with the car was basically John could use the car until he paid it off. That is, he paid his father for paying it off.
Mm-hmm.
But if his father ever deemed that John did something that did not meet his approval, he would take the keys away. And so this led to a lot of friction between John and his father.
That is called manipulation and control.
His father was, very controlling. So much so that John eventually, at one point, just said, to hell with this. He took the car and he ran away. And he ended up in Las Vegas, where he worked for a short time with an ambulance company. And probably most eerie of all in hindsight was he worked for a mortuary. And later in his life, in interviews, John Wayne Gacy would talk about how he didn't have anywhere to live, so they provided him a place to live at the mortuary, which happened to be the embalming room. So he would sleep amongst freshly embalmed corpses, the night before they had their funeral.
So the layers just keep getting...
It just keeps getting a little more macabre with every turn. Now, the thing about John, too, was he said, this was an incident that I think is telling, considering what happened later. He said that at one point when he was sleeping in this embalming room, there was a young boy who had died, who had been made up and was in his coffin. And one night he decided to climb into the coffin with this boy because he found him attractive. And he slept at least part of the night with this boy's corpse in his coffin. And this freaked him out because this is the first time John had done anything like this. So even he got freaked out by this. He got so freaked out that the next day he called his mother and he said, is there any way I can come back home? And he hightailed it back to Chicago. Mm-hmm. So I guess it just goes to show, at least at this early age, John Wayne Gacy was capable of freaking himself out. Though he never actually completed high school, he got a diploma later when he was in prison. But at this point, he did not have a high school diploma. Somehow he wound up going to Northwestern Business College, and he was taking classes there. And from there, he got a job with a shoe company. And this is when things start to get a little bit better in John's life. He was rambling around Roman. He had that one strange incident with the corpse, but besides that, his life has been pretty difficult. He met a woman named Marlene Myers. And her father owned a chain of KFCs, Kentucky Fried Chickens, in that sort of Iowa, sort of Illinois area. And they fell for each other, John and Marlene. And they got engaged. And then quickly after that, they got married. So, John found a wife. Mm-hmm. And not long after that, John started having children with her. So it's starting to look like, wow, look, John's got his life back together.
Yeah.
The father-in-law gives him a job managing 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. Now, these jobs, they paid him $15,000 a year plus a percentage of the profits from the store, which in 1966 is not bad.
Good. Yeah, that's good money back then.
Yeah. And so he's providing for his family, his wife. Even his father comes along at one point during the birth of his first child, whose name was Christopher, a son, John Wayne Gacy's first child. And he says, son, you've really made something of yourself, and I was wrong about you. I think you turned out well. So it's starting to look like everything's going great in John's life, right?
Mm-hmm.
He goes on, he has a daughter, a second child with Marlene, whose name was Christine. She was born in 1967. So Michael in 66, Christine in 67, he's not holding back, he's having these kids in rapid succession. John later said this was the best time of his life. Mm-hmm. He was a family man. He was a successful businessman. His father was finally starting to come around and seeing that, maybe John has made something of himself. But, John started to kind of shoot himself in the foot because he was starting to go out and find prostitutes, cheat on his wife with them. There was several instances, and John Wayne Gacy's sister talked about this later on, where apparently him and Marlene were involved in swinger parties where, again, this is the late 60s, so a bunch of couples get together and they leave. They part ways at the end of the night, but they're not parting ways with someone who's their wife or their husband. They're swapping out spouses and they're going home with them. John became involved, really intensely involved, with the JCs, which is the Junior Chamber of Commerce. And he rose in the rank of the JCs very quickly. He became very well known for being a guy who could enlist many, many new members, sometimes 20 members a night. One of the reasons John Wayne Gacy could enlist so many members, male members, is because he would rent out a room in a motel, show stag films, and hire hookers to come in and to perform orgies with it. So, and then by the end of the night, all the dudes are like, "Yeah, I'll be a JC, sign me up," you know.
It's the best form of promotion that he could get.
Yeah, you know. And so, hey, what can I say? I guess prostitution is illegal in Iowa, but at least they were consenting adults. Sadly, this did not last very long, because in August of 1967, John, okay, one of his fellow JCs was a man named Mr. Voorhees, no relation to Jason. And Mr. Voorhees had a 15-year-old son named Donald. Well, John Wayne Gacy told his friend's son, "You can come over to my house and we'll watch some porn together."
That's what you do, you know.
Right.
What is
you know. And one thing led to another, and the next thing you know, he's eliciting Donald Voorhees, a 15-year-old boy, to give him oral sex. And so the boy did it, and only he didn't stay quiet about it, and he told his father what had happened. And so in March of the next year, John Wayne Gacy was arrested on a charge of, one of the charges was sodomy and for molesting this child. Now, that's not really where that story ends with Donald Voorhees, because at this point, John Wayne Gacy, was working at the KFC, but he was also starting to get into construction a little bit. And he hired young teenage boys as his workforce in some of his construction businesses that he was starting up. One of these boys was an 18-year-old named Russell Schroeder. So John Wayne Gacy gave Russell Schroeder some money, and he said, "This is what I want you to do. This boy is accusing me of sexual assault. I got to get him to shut up about that. So, Russell, what I want you to do is to befriend this boy, lure him out into a isolated spot, and work him over. And tell him, don't you ever say anything about John Wayne Gacy to the police. Drop the charges. You were lying." Well, Russell Schroeder took the money and did this. He beat up Donald Voorhees. But he was arrested because Donald Voorhees was like, "Tell you what, I'm going to tell on you too." And when Russell Schroeder was interrogated by the police, he spilled the beans that John had given him money to go beat up Donald Voorhees to get him to shut up about these charges, which led to another charge being slapped onto John Wayne Gacy.
Now he has to hire someone else to go after both of them.
I know, it's a long string of assaults that are going to begin. It's like the mafia, only with one guy, John Wayne Gacy.
And he's kind of inept at it.
And did you hear about this? John Wayne Gacy actually did used to tell these people that he was connected with the mob in Chicago, which, as far as we know, is not true. But I guess that was another way of intimidating, someone like Donald Voorhees, who might speak out after you did some horrible things to him. So the police started to wonder, like, what's up with this guy's head? Like, what would you guys think? Would you think this was normal behavior? And I'm not talking about just the sexual molestation, but also hiring the kid.
No.
A little.
No, why? Please tell me they put him in jail.
Well, they did, but they did a psych eval on him first, because he was going through so much trouble to try and get this kid to shut up. They were like, "There's got to be something wrong in this guy's head beyond the fact that he does these things with young boys." And
please tell me that when all of this stuff came out later, they weren't like, "Oh, we're so shocked."
We do run into that a lot too. Remember when we did Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yeah.
All these past offenses, and it's like, guys, look at this past, But good call, though, Rebecca, because we will get to that.
I'm trying to remember, if you can remember we talked about the evaluation chart?
Yes.
I'm trying to remember where Gacy was on that. I think he was like a 32 or something.
Yes, he was relatively high.
Yeah.
That, as I recall. But yeah, that was something we discussed on our Ramirez show, was it not?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Which is kind of fascinating if you want to go back and watch our discussion on that on the previous serial killer show we did. This will make you happy, Rebecca. He was convicted promptly of these charges, December 3rd of 1968, and was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
But he didn't serve that long.
Hell no. He didn't serve anywhere near that long. It's amazing. His wife promptly divorced him, by the way. Marlene. It was actually the day the conviction happened, she filed for divorce. And John Wayne Gacy never saw his first wife or his 2 children again. They were gone. So he became a model prisoner when he was sent to serve his time. Everyone talked highly of. This is the thing about John Wayne Gacy, which relates back to like a show we did on Ted Bundy. He seemed to be one of these guys who could really convince you that he was a good dude. He had that sort of knack, whatever that knack is.
Charisma.
I was going to say it's part of his killer instinct.
There you go.
Right.
Lure them in.
Kind
of like the vampire thing. They always say that they glamour you.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely
reel you in.
You're absolutely right there, because when you have someone's trust, you can pretty much at a certain point do whatever you want. They're never going to think, well, and that's exactly what happened with John Wayne Gacy. Because remember, I was telling you he was in with the JCs, the stack parties, and he was in with the Democratic Party. There were many upstanding citizens who thought when he was arrested and even when he was convicted of this charge, John didn't do this. This is a plot against him, because that was one of his excuses. He said that a rival of his in the JCs had organized this whole thing and gotten this kid to tell lies about him to wreck his future election, because he wanted to be John Wayne wanted to be elected as president of the JCs. So he even had, when he was convicted and was in prison as the head chef in prison, he had people on the outside saying, John is innocent of that charge. It's a shame that he was put away. Now, what you were asking before about the death of his father, that happened while he was in prison for this charge. Okay. His father died of cirrhosis of the liver before John Wayne Gacy was granted parole, which was, get this, in June 18th of 1970. So he only served 18 months, not even 2 years of his 10-year sentence. And he was already back out on the streets, not in Waterloo. He moved back in with his mother. And that was part of his parole when he got released, is he had to go and have a stable, so he moved back in with his mom in Chicago, became a short order cook. But actually, that was not the end of his whole rise, because in a way, once he got out of prison, that was like a sort of a line in the sand, and then a second life began after that. So you would think that his career is ruined, all of that is over with. That's not actually the case. Even though on February 12th of 1971, just barely, not even a year after he was paroled, he was charged with sexually assaulting another boy who he picked up at a Greyhound station. But on this occasion, the charges were dropped because the boy failed to appear in court. So I don't know if John sent another kid out to beat him up or what, but the kid didn't appear in court. Now, with his mother's help, John bought a home, West Somerdale Avenue, there in the Chicago area. And this is the home where he would stay for the rest of his life in terms of, up until his eventual arrest. This is the home where everything happened, shall we say. The now infamous home, which no longer stands. He began dating a divorcee at this time who had 2 daughters of her own named Carol Hoff. Carol trusted him, so much so that she brought her daughters into his life. I don't know how much Carol knew about his previous prison sentence. I assume she probably knew something about it, but her daughters.
She had to.
You know she had to. I mean, you know, you can't really get away from that. Even though it was in another state, you still, that kind of thing tends to follow.
Yeah.
They actually had known each other in high school, so that may have been part of it. She sort of knew him before, so maybe she thought, well, he had something happen to him. And I'm sure he's filling her head with this whole thing of it was a setup, you know, he's probably still going on that. I didn't really do that, but I just served my time, you know. And following this marriage to Carol, because he did get married to her, he started a construction company called the PDM Contractors, which you know, it was very successful. By 1978, that company was making $200,000 a year. So that'll give you some idea that John Wayne Gacy knew how to run a business.
I mean, back then, 200,000 a year was a fun chunk of change.
That's right.
Yeah.
And again, he went back to employing teenage boys who he could pay more than they would get at, like, you know, McDonald's. But it's not like you have to pay a teenage boy all that much to get his services. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And he also became active in the Democratic Party. There's the famous picture of him standing next to Jimmy Carter's wife at a party, at a Democratic fundraiser, which I'm sure she absolutely loves the fact that that picture was taken. Now, he began performing in children's parties, and this is where we get into the infamous Pogo the Clown, which was, you know, when you see John Wayne Gacy, a lot of times you'll see the picture of him dressed up as a clown. I myself have no fear of clowns. Rebecca, you mentioned something earlier that you thought.
I said, you know, it, you know, puts a whole new spin on the it thing. You know.
Right, any connection.
Evil clown coming after you.
Right.
Growing up, I didn't like clowns.
You didn't like clowns?
I did not. It's only since I was about 24, 25, I grew out of it.
See, I liked Bozo.
I did like
that little ball in the bucket and try to win a bike.
I liked Bozo, but I'll tell you, I'm not afraid of clowns, but seeing him in that get up, I'm like, that's horrifying. Yeah. Maybe it's only because, you know, after the fact it's horrifying. But I'll tell you this much. 1975, Gacy told his wife, Carol, that he was bisexual.
Yeah. And
she found some gay porn in his belongings, along with some other quite unusual things. One of the things that she found that was quite unusual was driver's licenses, class rings, and certain other personal effects that should not have been there.
Yeah.
And so in 1976, they divorced one another by mutual consent because she knew something was going on here with John, and it had to do with gay porn. And even worse than that, far worse than that, he had driver's licenses of people that he shouldn't have had. Now, to explain that, we have to jump backwards in time just a little bit. We got to go back to things that were going on as his wife, you know, was living with him and with her daughters. January 2nd of 1972, there was a young man, 16 years old, named Timothy McCoy. He was picked up at a Greyhound station and by John Wayne Gacy while John was cruising, which is something John talked about often that he liked to do, was he liked to kind of cruise around and look for boys that he found attractive. Mm-hmm. Well, he found Timothy McCoy, and he told him, I'm going to give you a free trip sightseeing around Chicago. And so they took the kid around Chicago, sightseeing, and then eventually at the end of the night, he took him back to his house. John took him back to his own house, and he said, I'll let you stay the night with me, and then tomorrow I'll drive you back to the bus station to catch your bus out of town. So Tim McCoy said, fine. Now, there are differing stories about what happened next. According to John Wayne Gacy, what happened was that in the middle of the night, he woke up, and this 16-year-old Tim McCoy was in his bedroom with a kitchen knife saying, I'm going to take your money. And Gacy said that he jumped out of bed and struggled with the boy for the knife, and the boy cut his arm, which he had a scar on his arm to prove to the police that this happened, supposedly. And then he said when he got the knife away from the boy, he was so enraged that he stabbed the boy 3 times in the chest and killed him. Now, whether you believe that or whether you believe that there was no robbery attempt, that John Wayne Gacy just went into this kid's room and murdered him with a knife, I don't know.
And
Who
the
knows?
scar was self-defense.
Yeah, the scar could have come from anywhere, right? I mean, it could have been self-defense. It could have come from another case entirely. Yeah. He could have scarred himself, totally unrelated to a murder. I mean, who knows? You know. But what Gacy said, that in killing this boy, he realized, you know, that the ultimate thrill was murder, because he found the sexual satisfaction to it, which, again, up until this time, he was only molesting children. Now, out of nowhere, he's just started murdering teenagers, and he's thrilled by it. So this begins a long string of horrific crimes that took place in that house. In January of 74, which was 2 years later, he took his second victim. Now remember, his wife was still with him at this time. He and his wife didn't divorce until 1976. And at some points in this, his mother was living with him. So he wasn't free to just bring people to the house and murder them. But in January of 74, he murdered a victim who is still unidentified. And like Timothy McCoy, he buried the boy in the crawl space underneath his house, right, in the little basement area. Now, by 75, prior to the divorce, he's cruising around looking for boys. What he would do is he would take them back to the house where he lived, and he would perform what he called the handcuff trick with them. And what the handcuff trick is he would tell these boys, he would say, listen, I got this pair of handcuffs, and they're trick handcuffs, all right? So I'm going to put these handcuffs on you, and you're going to see if you can find the trick to getting out of them. And so the boys would put the handcuffs on behind their back, and then John Wayne Gacy would say, okay, look, here's the deal. Trick to this thing is you have to have the key, right? And so that was the trick. So then he would have them in the handcuffs. Then he would basically wrap a rope around their neck, put a piece of wood in the rope, and turn it like a tourniquet. And that way he could strangle them to death as slowly as he wanted to. Right. Now, the neighbors in this area later on noted that they sometimes could hear kind of muffled screams coming from somewhere in the neighborhood. They could not decipher where these screams were coming from, or else I'm sure they would have called the police. But anyway, that was how John Wayne Gacy got a lot of these victims. Now, after his divorce, these murders intensified because Gacy was no longer in a position where he had hindrances, that is, a wife and children. Right? And so what happened basically was in April and May of 1976, he kidnapped and he murdered 3 boys, right? 2 in the same night in May. And then 2 more in June, right? Then on January 26, 1976, there was a young boy that worked for him named David Cram, who was 18. And he moved into Gacy's guest house, and into his guest room, rather, in his house. And the next night, I guess Gacy didn't waste any time. He used this handcuff trick on David Cram. And David Cram, who had been in the military and in the Army, he wasn't having it. And he wound up kicking John Wayne Gacy in the head. And he managed to get the key somehow away from Gacy, unlocked himself, went back in his room, and barricaded the door. Now, if it was me, what I would do is I would say, excuse me, I'm totally out of this thing. I'm leaving this house. I'm not here anymore. That's not really what David Cram did. He actually stayed there another month, which, you know, wow. I mean,
that's crazy.
He didn't kick him in the head hard enough.
No, I guess he didn't. He should have just killed him while he had the chance. I'm talking about David Cram. Should have killed John Wayne Gacy. But I don't think David Cram realized that this guy was a serial killer to the level that, you know, that he was, or maybe he would have. But anyway, a month later, apparently Gacy came in and tried to get it on with David Cram, and David Cram was like, "Forget this," and he promptly left the house. So, Gacy had, during this time, a number of young employers of his digging trenches underneath the house. And this included a young guy named Gregory Godson, who was 17 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Gregory went missing in December of 1976. So, oddly enough, Gregory ended up essentially digging his own grave. And so, it's a sad note. These people had no idea this was going down. Now, in March of 77, Gacy's business started to pick up. He was involved in that year in 80 building remodels. Okay.
Wow.
So that was a lot of money he was making. And he also had a very short-lived engagement to a woman who, she was a young woman, and that kind of slowed him down for a short time in terms of the murder spree. When the engagement ended, however, all of his extracurricular activities, shall we say, picked up again. Now, the problem was that the basement was starting to fill up with, whether not a basement, the crawl space was starting to fill up with bodies. So much so that he had no more places to put these victims. And so he began to dispose of these victims into the Plain River. 5 victims, his last 5 victims actually, he disposed of in the river, not underneath his house. Only 4 bodies were found of the 5.
Wow.
So what eventually ended this whole thing for Gacy was on the afternoon of December the 11th, 1978, Gacy discussed a remodeling project at a local pharmacy with the owner of that pharmacy. And there was a young stock boy who worked at this pharmacy named Robert Peist, and he was 15. And he overheard John Wayne Gacy talking to the owner about how much he paid his young employees, which was $5 an hour, which is double what Robert was making at the pharmacy. And so, he told his mom, listen, I want to go outside and talk to this guy about maybe getting a job, which, at the construction company, which he did. The only problem is Robert was never seen again. Now, his mother wasn't one to be trifled with, because she promptly went to the police and filed a missing persons report about Robert, and Gacy was interrogated by the police.
His last name was Winch, right? Yeah.
Who's that? Robert?
Robert Winch?
No, it was Robert Peist.
Peist, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So Gacy was interrogated. When he came in for his interrogation, the actual sit-down interrogation at the police station, he was covered in mud. He said he had a car accident, which incidentally was true, but the car accident took place as he was driving back from disposing of Robert's body. The police pursued this, and a search warrant was drawn up for his house. So the cops go into John Wayne Gacy's house, and they find various driver's licenses, they find handcuffs, they find a syringe, they find clothing for men who were far smaller than John Wayne Gacy ever was. They find a high school class ring, and some other really strange things like a board, a 2x4 with holes drilled into the end of it. And it's like, what is this? So pursuant to this, the cops set up 2-man surveillance, and they began to follow John Wayne Gacy around everywhere. They followed him around so much that Gacy eventually filed a civil suit against the police saying they were harassing him. Now, the same day that the civil suit was filed, which was December 18th of 1978, the cops found this photo receipt that was in his house amidst the search. And they were able to trace this photo receipt back to Robert's girlfriend, who had put these photos in at the pharmacy. She'd gotten her little ticket back, and she'd put it in Robert's jacket pocket the day he went missing. So the question becomes, how did a ticket receipt for photographs end up in John Wayne Gacy's house when the last place it was put was in the, missing boy's pocket? Now, David Cram, remember him, the one who lived with Gacy, who stayed in the guest room for way longer than he should have? Mm-hmm. He talked to the police. And what they learned from David Cram was that Gacy several times had Cram go down in the crawl space and spread lime around. Okay? So, all this stuff is starting to build up. On the night of December 20th, Gacy went to his lawyer's office, and he basically just fell to pieces. He asked for an alcoholic beverage, and then once he got it, he started to confess to his lawyer, again, not the police, but to his lawyer, all these things she did. Gacy said, "I've been judge, jury, and executioner for many, many people over the years. And the drunker he got, the more he spilled, the more beans were being spilled." So, Gacy basically was giving up to his lawyer, but to the next day, he basically gave up to the police because a second search warrant was enacted, and that's when the police went into the crawl space as David Cram had instructed, and they wound up finding 26 of his 33 victims underneath his house, buried under mud and water, basically, because there was a sump pump that was down in the crawl space that kept them. So what Gacy would do is he would let the crawl space flood, and then when he would want to put a body down there, he'd turn on the sump pump, drain all the water out, and then put the body in it, bury it, and then he would let it fill up again. So the police got wise to that. Naturally, they're smelling all kinds of crazy shit coming out from his crawl space, because you don't put 26 bodies in mud and water and leave it there, even with lime, and it's not going to smell.
At some point, somebody had to question him on why he was buying so much lime.
Yeah, I mean, you would think. I guess he would always say, "Well, I own a construction business," or something.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a good cover. He had a lot of good cover stories. I mean, in every regard.
Yes. Yeah. And he had his personality, which seemed to be fairly winning, at least for the people that trusted him. Now, he confessed to the police finally on the morning of December 22nd, 1978. And he said, actually, he told the police that the next month in January, he was planning to cover the dirt in his basement with cement and completely, permanently seal it off and seal the bodies beneath it. He didn't make it to that step, however. Now, Gacy, after this confession, he went to trial. The trial actually, he was arrested in 1978. The trial didn't begin until February of 1980. And he was charged, and I assume the police were gathering all the evidence they could for the 33 murders they were going to charge him with. Now, Gacy attempted an insanity plea saying he had multiple personalities. I remember, when I was a teenager at talk shows, you couldn't get away from this multiple personality thing. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really hear so much about it now unless it's in like a movie like Split, something like that. But, back in the day, I remember multiple personalities was like the shit. So I guess John Wayne Gacy watched Sybil, and he was like, because that came out in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. And he was like, this sounds like a great alibi. Well, nobody was buying it. The jury didn't buy it. And so they deliberated for 2 hours, and they determined, this guy's guilty as sin on all these charges. And he was sentenced to death. Yeah. So what do you guys think? Do you think that there was mental illness involved here? Do you think he had a split personality?
I don't know about split personality, but I mean, you have to be mentally ill to do that kind of thing anyway. I mean, you're not right. I mean,
No,
people...
he was definitely not right in the head, but no, I'm with Rebecca on this. I don't think he was clinically, split personality or maybe, I don't know, a bit of bipolar disorder or something. I don't know, PTSD. There's 1,000 different things that he could have had wrong with him, but I don't think split personality was one of them.
That's true, yeah. As I've said before on the show, he had a million problems, but split personalities weren't one.
Yeah.
He was. Did I mention that he was sentenced to death? He went but he didn't. Like most people on death row, he spent like 14 years in prison on death row.
Although,
yeah,
when he joined the Jolly Joker Club and started doing all the work with the fundraising with the Moose Club and whatnot, I wonder, is it possible that taking on the persona of Pogo the Clown, or actually went by, was it Patches the Clown also?
Both, yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering when he got in the character of Pogo or Patches, was there a possibility that there was that mental shift? So,
well, it's something that David Cram said the night that he was first attacked by John Wayne Gacy, the boy that was living with him. He said that, when he came in the night that Gacy pulled the handcuff trick on him, that Gacy was dressed up like a clown. And that Gacy would start giggling and stuff like a kid or like a clown, and would go in and out of these like modes when he was being normal John and then going into like crazy John. And then eventually he started like cackling and grabbed him by the handcuffs, spun him around, told him he was going to rape him and all this. And by that point, I'm sure Cram was like, oh God, I got to get the fuck out of here. But he didn't for a month. Yeah. I don't know. I'm still beyond that. I mean, I'm not trying to say anything about David, but man, I'm sorry. The first time my landlord dresses as a clown, handcuffs me, and tells me he's going to rape me, my fucking ass is out the door. I mean,
yes.
But anyway, maybe he had nowhere else to go. Maybe he was a runaway. I don't know. But John was a painter. He was no Michelangelo, but he was a little bit of a painter. He started selling these paintings, and the courts allowed him to keep some of the profits that he made from these paintings. And, he would do them in his cell. He would sell them. These things have been auctioned off after the fact. I've heard rumor that one of them went for $20,000.
Wow.
Generally they go in the hundreds, but I think someone bought a Gacy painting for like 20 grand. I think part of it is because they're fairly rare, because after he was eventually executed, a lot of the victims' families took his paintings and burned them at a bonfire, and for the whole idea of like, we're not letting this guy's shit get out there and people make money, and so I think probably the rarity of them is probably what drove up the prices. But again, I mean, I don't know that I'm going to pay $20,000 for a painting that was done by John Wayne Gacy on death row of a clown. Or, he liked to do like the Seven Dwarfs and stuff. All his paintings were usually pretty cartoony. And he said he just hoped they could bring joy to the world. So that'll give you some idea of how delusional this guy was. So he was attempting appeals this whole time. Right up until October of 1993, he was attempting appeals. And October of 93 is when the final appeal was denied. Finally, he was going to be executed. And so May the 10th of 1994, just after noon, Gacy was pronounced dead from lethal injection. It wasn't actually a very smooth procedure. It took 18 minutes because the IVs kept getting clogged by the chemicals. But eventually, after 18 minutes, Gacy stopped breathing, died. It was over with. And, his body was eventually cremated, and I'm sure his children wanted nothing to do with his ashes. But I don't know. But anyway, I mean, that's the story of John Wayne Gacy. Yet another in a long line of very crazy people we've talked about.
But like we
So
were talking before the show, but still there are some kind of similarities between a lot of them.
yes,
Oh, very
You
much
know.
so.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So what are your thoughts on this whole Gacy thing?
I think his past with his father may have had something. Well, obviously, it had something to do with it. I don't think he can or could have tried to make anyone think that he was split personality or it's good for, hey, look at me, I have something wrong with me, take pity on me, please. But I don't think that he was clinically insane to that point,
Yeah,
for lack of better terms, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, he had a lot going on at an early age. And like we said earlier, I mean, as do a lot of people. But it determines, like, are you the monster or are you a human being? Are you going to act on that stuff or not? And he
Yeah.
just kind of went over the top with it.
And had, like with the others, no remorse.
Yeah, no
And
remorse.
it's always let me flip the story around
Yeah,
and
but
I'm the victim. Yeah.
and there are serial killers out there too that they'll dispose of bodies and whatnot, but he kept them in his basement. That's ballsy, man.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I
Stinking
mean,
up the
that's
neighborhood.
right. And then I mean, like throwing back to where Ed Gein when we did Gein. I mean, he was, well, he kept people home and made them into things,
yeah.
parts of them anyway. And yeah, so I mean, he was like flooding the basement, dropping bodies down there, liming them because if people didn't know, if you throw lime on a body, it decomposes it, kind of turns it into like a ball of jello,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah, and that was the thing is he seemed to like having them close. I don't know if it was because he lived in a suburban neighborhood and he was afraid of maybe one night being caught taking the bodies away. But even
Wouldn't you
when,
think the smell though?
yeah, I mean, I would. It must have been horrible.
The neighbors should have put in a complaint to the city and said, guys, like, you got to go and check it out. There's something wrong with either the sewer or there's more to it than that. And how do you have decomposing body after body after body in your basement and nobody investigated?
Yeah, it's pretty hard to believe. I mean,
It really is.
but I mean, that was, I don't know. Even after he started disposing of them in the river, originally his idea was when the crawl space filled up, he was just going to put them in the attic, and then he realized it might leak. So, I mean, he obviously wanted to keep them there for whatever reason. Whether he was afraid of taking them away or whether that was part of his crazy, I don't know.
But then you had the 5 he just dumped in the
Yeah.
river.
When it filled up, then he took the last 5 and dumped them in the river.
Well, he's a construction guy. Should have built another building, right?
That's right. That's a good point.
And he did. I mean, like, he tried at several points in his life, he tried to live that normal life.
Yeah.
He was a construction worker. He tried being a dad. He was trying to be that family guy. And then, when he left his wife on Valentine's, I mean, he said that was the last time they were ever going to have sex. I mean, he was bisexual and he just didn't want anything to do with her anymore, which actually, well, I mean, yeah, if he at that point looked at his wife and said they weren't going to have sex anymore, now you're not bisexual. Now you're gay.
Yeah. Which he always said, I'm not gay. I'm never gay.
He did. He always said that he wasn't gay, that he was bisexual.
Yeah.
But if you're cutting off relationship, sexual intimacy with your wife because you're attracted to men.
And maybe that has something to do with the father. It's just so ingrained in him that he will never be able to admit that he is what he is. He's gay.
And that's true. And a lot of people, like, that have talked about him before said that he couldn't deal with the fact that he was gay. And that's why he hid behind the persona of Pogo the Clown.
Yeah.
And, he could revert to a childlike stage and forget about who he is now and try to be a little child again.
Yeah.
Even
Just
though,
the unfortunate part is the child was also a vicious murderer.
Well, yes.
That side of him,
Yeah. And yeah, it all had to stem from the way his father treated him, belittled him, never gave him any kind of affection or gratitude or good job, son. The only time he said to him he was happy and proud of him at that one time.
Yeah.
you know, right? And I mean, the dude was, he ran KFCs. He was a construction worker. He tried being a clown with that Jolly Joker group and all that stuff, but I think that was just a farce in order for him to lure kids, personally.
It sure seems that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Reverting back to what you said earlier, what we all were talking about there, the parties he used to throw, the stag parties, to try to get people involved. As a lighthearted joke, you imagine him walking in dressed as Pogo the Clown, watching porn, and handing you a bucket of KFC chicken.
Right. Yeah. And sign up for the JCs. Here you go.
Sign up for the JCs.
Yeah. What a scene that must be. That's like David Lynch's worst nightmare.
Right.
But yeah, so it's an interesting case. I think we've given a good bit of time to it. I appreciate you guys jumping on here with me and talking about Johnny Wayne Gacy. And, I hope you guys enjoyed watching. I want to thank you guys again. Rebecca, thanks for joining me.
Sure.
And CW, as always, talking about these gruesome things. We try to make it at least somewhat entertaining, and tolerable. But anyway, and I want to thank you guys for watching as well. So until next time, take care of yourselves.